Welcome to Bits and Pieces Quilting. Today I'd like to share with you a trunk show of all the quilts that we've kept for ourselves. Stay tuned. Hi, I'm Michelle, and today I'd like to share with you part 2 of all of the quilts that we have kept for ourselves. As I shared in part 1, I just keep making quilts because I love them. And very often I'll give them away to friends and family, but there are a few that we have kept for ourselves. And maybe those few have grown into more than a few. But as I asked in part 1, how many quilts does one family really need? And for me, I haven't quite determined what that answer is yet. Every now and then, there's a quilt that's just so special that I can't really part with it. And so today I'd like to share with you 10 quilts as part 2 that are still with us that we use on a regular basis. The first quilt I'd like to share is this fall Halloween themed quilt. It's based on a pattern called Happy Halloween, but I didn't really love the cat or the fence in the original pattern. So in the final project, I left that out. But I used the pattern to inspire the 9 patches and solid blocks that make up this quilt. The oranges and the purples, they're just really favorite colors of mine. You'll see in part 1, I think the first quilt I presented is also made up of oranges and purples. The border on this is a super cute fabric with little ghosts in it, and there's some other Halloween fabric sprinkled throughout the project. It is cozy with a flannel back. It's warm in terms of colors, but also warm in terms of being a quilt. And I really, really like it. This second quilt is a little wall hanging, and it is, for those who don't recognize it, a map of what the District of Columbia looks like. Jason and I were working and living in Washington, D.C. at the time, and I saw on another YouTube video where a creator had taken the outline of the shape of the state that they lived in and turned it into a quilt. And I thought, what a great way to commemorate our time in Washington. We lived there for just 4.5 years, but it was a fantastic experience. And this was a great way to commemorate that. It was also a really fun way to use up some really, really tiny leftover bits and pieces. All of these little bits have been sewn together. None of them is bigger than about 1.5 inches wide. And so sewn all together, they give this very cool striped look, but it's a great way to use up really tiny bits of fabric. I just searched for an outline of the District of Columbia online, printed it out, enlarged it on a printer to a size that I was happy with. I think it took a couple of pieces of paper in this instance, traced it out on my fabric, used that printed paper as a pattern, cut out the shape, and then just used a zigzag stitch over the edge in order to tack it all down. I ended up making a couple of these for friends and neighbors, and this just really reminds us of a great time and a great experience living in Washington. This next quilt is one of the quilts that we use probably most often. It is very frequently on our bed in the warmer weather. It's one of our lighter weight quilts, but we use this all the time through spring and summer. It's called Falling Foliage. And we picked up this pattern and the fabric on a trip to Las Vegas many, many years ago, probably 20 some odd years ago. Went to a quilt shop, saw the pattern, decided what a great way to commemorate the trip, buy the pattern, the fabric, take it home, and remember that experience, but then also have something tangible and useful. This was one of the very first times I had ever done any kind of applique. So the leaves that are on here are appliqued. I just used a fusible interfacing and zigzagged around the edges in order to finish this. It has washed and worn a lot and has held up really well, There are a few places where that tiny little beige inner border is starting to pull away and the fabric is starting to get a little thin, but I will either just leave it or maybe someday go in and do a little bit of repair work on it. It's a family favorite and we use it all the time. This next quilt is the ultimate in scrappy. It's a project that was led by a friend in my quilt group, and she called it Chop Suey. And it is sort of an everything in the kitchen sink kind of pattern, and I absolutely love it. I went through and decided that this was going to be one of my very first quilts made just for me. And I went through my collection and picked out pieces of every single one of my very favorite fabrics. And from that, made this Chop Suey quilt. It's a riot of color, but as you can see, there's a harmony to it in that all of the fabrics have that traditional muted color palette that I think works really well. And then to make the very most of all the bits and pieces, I used some of the offcuts from making the blocks in the center of the quilt to make the inner border that goes around the outside edge. I set it off with a navy blue because I think that's a great background for a scrappy quilt, and then finished it off with a scrappy binding. This, I always feel like, is my personal quilt. This one's mine, with my favorite colors, my favorite fabrics, and I use it a lot when I'm reading a good book. This quilt is an interesting one because it's a mix of leftovers, but then also a few purchased fabrics to round out the leftovers. I was looking through my collection of fabrics and I realized I had a lot of projects that I had made from this same line of fabrics. And by combining them together, I probably had enough for another quilt. So in looking for a pattern, I decided on this one. It is from Scrap Basket Sensations from Kim Brackett. You've seen, I think, that I've used this pattern book quite often for some of my projects. She calls it Over and Under, and you can see I've made it in almost exactly the same colorway. It's a great pattern. It's really easy, made primarily out of jelly roll strips, but you can see from the version that I did that I wanted it to be a little bit bigger. So I added a number of different borders to it to expand out the size of the quilt and to really use up every last bit and piece in order to make the quilt as large as possible and to use those fabrics up in my collection. This project was also great to practice some machine quilting, and I've put some feathers into the colored printed fabric part of the design and some tight free motion quilting into the background, into the white parts of the design, just to practice those different shapes and to try and improve my overall machine quilting skills. There's flannel on the back of this quilt, so it's quite warm. It finished at about 65 or 70 inches square, so this makes a really great bed topper for us when it's a really cold night. It's not big enough to cover us as a bed quilt, but if we're looking for a little extra weight and warmth, we very often put this quilt on and use it. This was my first and so far I think my only large character focal point quilt. It is called Honu Kai, and Jason and I purchased the kit and the pattern when we visited the Big Island of Hawaii. The wildlife there and the natural beauty are so spectacular, and this seemed like a really great way to commemorate that vacation. Jason's a scuba diver, so he spent quite a lot of time underwater during this particular vacation. He saw lots of sea turtles, lots of rays, lots of fish, and so he in particular really loved this pattern. It was not difficult to make, but I did learn a few things. In particular, I learned that I should probably find other ways to thin out the fusible interfacing. When I cut the pieces, I used a full piece of interfacing behind every single one of them. And what I probably should have done was cut out the centers and just used the fusible interfacing around the edge of the fabric, because now it has a little bit of a stiffness to it that I would probably change if I went back to make it again. This was also another project where I really wanted to do some work on my machine quilting skills. So I put a lot of outline and emphasis quilting into the seaweed, and then tried to quilt the feeling of water all through the background. It took me a really long time, but I'm thrilled with the results. I think it has great texture, great movement, and makes the back almost as interesting as the front. Well, okay, maybe not as interesting, but for someone who's a quilter, I think the back looks pretty cool. This quilt is our travel quilt. For years, Jason was collecting these patches and badges from all kinds of places with not really a clear idea of what to do with them. Then we decided, you know what, let's make a quilt out of them. So we saved them again for a little while until the stack of them was pretty significant, and I thought, all right, it's time to make the travel quilt. So I did a little bit of testing to see what would make the most sense. Sewing the patches to the quilt top seemed like a bad idea because the quilt top would become very unwieldy in my view in order to then sandwich it with the backing and the batting. So I thought, if I don't sew the badges to the quilt top before the quilt's finished, I should sew the badges to the quilt when it is finished. But then how difficult will it be to sew the badges through all the layers, through the top of the fabric, through the batting, through the backing, and then of course through the badge itself? And would my sewing machine be able to handle that? So we actually had a patch that we weren't going to include in the quilt. It was something left over from childhood or something ratty. I don't even remember what it was. But I do remember testing it on my sewing machine to see how difficult it would be to sew on a patch through an entire quilt sandwich. And you know what? It wasn't that hard. I have a fabulous sewing machine. You should check out my video on my 5 expensive sewing tools that I'm so grateful to have. But I sew on a Juki, and it sewed through those patches really, really easily. So that was the route that I took. It was probably one of the more boring quilts ever to sew because it was just all these white squares framed with the blue with the little travel themed stars in between. And then once the whole thing was finished, then I sat down and started to sew on the patches. That had some challenges in that the quilt is now big and finished, and I'm trying to wedge it underneath my sewing machine to sew around, in some cases, some pretty tiny little squares. But I used the free motion setting on the machine, so I wasn't trying to spin the whole quilt around underneath the throat of the machine, and just moved around each piece with using the free motion foot, so I didn't have to wrestle the quilt under the sewing machine as it was. And even now we are continuing to add to it. You'll see I left a few vacant spaces so that the quilt could grow over time, and we continue to add to it. It's a really great reminder of some of the amazing places we've been and the fabulous things that we've seen, and just some great adventures that we've had. It's nice to look at it and reminisce. It's also morphed a tiny bit in that not all the patches represent travel or a vacation or a destination. Jason bought a patch when his very favorite hockey team won the Stanley Cup, and that's been added to the quilt. My brother is involved with some colleagues and friends, and he has made some patches representing his hobby and interest, and those have made it onto the quilt. Jason had some little Star Trek badges from, I'm not entirely sure where, but those have been added to the quilt. So it's a mix of memories and favorite things and places that we've been. It's a great, heavy, heavy quilt, but a real treasure. This quilt is probably one of the largest quilts I've ever made. It's a tessellated design, which means that every shape on the quilt is the same. So if you look at the pinwheels, whether they're light pinwheels, medium pinwheels, or dark pinwheels, they're all exactly the same shape. M.C. Escher is the famous artist that makes a lot of tessellated designs. I love this quilt. It's really simple. It's based on the book called Starburst Mosaic by Camille Remy. And it is easy and quick and fun to make, but the illusion of the tessellation, I think, is what gives it its beauty. I did this in a collection of fabric from Connecting Threads from many years ago, and this was the color of the wall in our bedroom at the time, so it really matched the room beautifully. It's a big quilt. This more than adequately covers us and keeps us warm in the winter, and as I said, is one of the largest quilts that I've ever made. From a large quilt to a small quilt. This is a small little Simpsons quilt that I made for Jason. I found the fabric. It was so cute. He loves The Simpsons. And so I thought I would make him a cute little quilt just to sit in front of the television with. It's probably not much bigger than a baby quilt or a lap quilt, but the colors are bright and cheerful. The Simpsons fabric, I made sure that it was all laid out directionally so that all the characters are all upright, which is great. And then I was lucky enough to find a matching flannel for the back. So this is the ultimate television quilt to watch The Simpsons while having The Simpsons cover your lap. You'll notice that it's a common pattern. It's in fact the same pattern as the travel quilt that I presented a little bit earlier in this video. It's based on a pattern from Pat Speth, and it's a pattern I use a lot when I want to showcase a particular fabric. This next quilt is much more recent, and in fact it was in an earlier video when I talked about some of the quilt projects that I was looking forward to working on. This is made up of fabric that all has an Australian Indigenous theme to it. I collected these fabrics from our very first visit to Australia in 2016, and then since moving here in 2019, I've accumulated a few other fabrics and made this quilt not that long ago to use these fabrics to commemorate our new home, and also because I just think the fabrics themselves are beautiful. Again, I didn't want to cut the pieces too small. I really wanted to showcase the fabric. So I used this attic windows pattern with the gray to set behind each of the fabric to try and give the illusion of those squares of fabric popping off the quilt. It has a piano key border as well to make the very most of the bits and pieces, and it's also a really nice size. We have used this over the past winter as a topper when it gets quite cold out, and I'm thrilled with the way it turned out. I think it really showcases the fabric and is quite beautiful. This is another TV themed quilt for Jason. It's a Star Trek quilt based on his all-time favorite sci-fi series. Jason has been a lifelong fan of Star Trek and is a Trekkie, Trekker, whatever they're called, and has been for his whole life. So when we were shopping and I saw the Star Trek fabric, I knew I had to get some and make Jason his very own Star Trek quilt. And if you're making a quilt about Star Trek, it should probably have stars. So this quilt has the yellow and the red stars to symbolize space and the voyage beyond, and then the Star Trek themed fabric on the front, and lucky enough, Star Trek flannel on the back. It was a thrill to find something so appropriate for someone, and another television quilt for Jason. The final quilt in this trunk show is this Bargello quilt. This is another old quilt, probably one of the very first ones I made for us, and one of the first quilts that was ever big enough to fit on our bed. It's a Bargello pattern. It's that undulating pattern of color that seems to wave across the quilt. The pattern came from a magazine, which I don't think I have anymore. I looked for it and couldn't find it. But I remember making this quilt at a quilt retreat, and I ran into a problem with the pattern. And it turns out that there was actually a mistake in the pattern. And I remember being on the floor of the quilt retreat, laying out these huge, long, skinny strips of multiple fabrics, trying to figure out why it wasn't looking right. And Joan was there, and Joan, if you see this, thank you. She was so kind to take this beginner quilter and help me figure out where the problem was so that I could sew it together and make this beautiful Bargello. It again goes on our bed. I ended up quilting it just with straight lines through each of the different diagonals to really try and highlight the movement of the quilt. We use it all the time. It's been washed and worn and used a lot, and in fact is still on the guest bed of one of our rooms here in the house today. So there you have it, another 10 quilts that we have kept for ourselves. I've looked through the closets and the cupboards and the drawers, and I think that that's getting pretty close to the entire quilt collection. How many quilts do you have that you use on a regular basis? And how many more do you think you need? Leave a comment down below and share with us some of your favorites. Thanks very much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Visit my website at bitsandpiecesquilting.com. And don't forget to make the most of your fabric bits and pieces.